This is 5 years long. It's a pattern that is happening within state agencies, and I'm talking about the fraud in dollars that are going out to fraudsters and to be wasted. We know that under full Democrat control, there have been OLA reports in the last few weeks that have come out, but yet not one person has lost their job or been held fully accountable to the fraud that is in the state of Minnesota. We believe that the majority is not taking the responsibility. They are not holding anyone accountable, and I'm pleased to tell you today that we do have where we can point out and come up with some solutions and ideas of how we can stop the fraud in the state of Minnesota. There's been alarming cases. One of the most egregious that has come to light in the last few weeks is the fraud of Feeding Our Future. That is proven by the OLA of $250 million of fraud that went out. Those dollars were intended to pay for meals for children that were hungry, children during the pandemic. But those dollars went out and they were misappropriated. We know that there are glaring deficiencies in oversight in allowing fraud to continue unchecked, and specifically in the case of Feeding Our Future, there were concerns already back in 2018 and 2019, prior to the pandemic, concerns that were brought forward. Not just Feeding Our Future, the $250 million that I've referenced, but in the child care assistance payment programs, almost half of the money spent was noted by the OLA to have gone out in fraud. Just a few weeks ago, another OLA report that came forward was on the frontline worker pay program. That was money that was supposed to have gone to those that were in the front lines during the pandemic. Those child care providers, nursing home assistants, nurses. Those were people that were fighting the battle during the pandemic. And so finally, there was $500 million appropriated by the legislature to go out to payments to those people. But yet it has been found by the OLA that $200 million, 41% of the amount allocated, went out to those that were ineligible or directly for fraud. On top of that, through Medicaid, there's been noted $500 million that was meant to go to non-emergency medical transport, PCA services, specialty clinic services, adult daycare. That has also gone out in fraud. And we know that when there is fraud, it hurts every Minnesotan. It means that those that needed the services or the dollars are not getting them. We also know that Minnesota does not have a revenue issue. We have a spending issue. So when we know that dollars are going out to fraud, again, it is not going to those that need it. And in Minnesota, taxpayers are tired of funding fraud. In all of the instances that I've mentioned so far, the OLA repeatedly found inadequate oversight, insufficient internal controls, and a lack of transparency. There were red flags that were ignored, investigations were non-existent, and necessary reforms were dismissed. So we know that we need to hold the Democrat-controlled state agencies accountable, and that actually starts with balanced government, where when there are concerns brought up or solutions before something is passed, that would be taken seriously. Concerns that are brought up need to be taken seriously. We know that this is about protecting the resources, again, that are meant for the most vulnerable in our state, our most vulnerable citizens in Minnesota. We need to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used in the way that they're intended. If Democrats are not willing to hold those accountable for the fraud, then House Republicans stand ready to do that job. I know you've just gotten passed out the timeline, and I want to point your attention to the timeline over here on my left, your right. This is an overview of the last 5 years of OLA reports noticing fraud, as I said, Feeding Our Future, the frontline worker pay. There's been fraud in grant award processes. The Minnesota Board on Aging Senior Nutrition Program, that report came out in November of 23. The Office of the Secretary of State, the Hometown Heroes Assistance Program, COVID-19 related emergency purchases, and oversight of state-funded grants to nonprofit organizations. Back in November of 22, the Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Board, the Minnesota Department of Health, COVID-19 related grants back in September of 22. Back in August of 22, Department of Human Services, the Homelessness and Housing Support Grants. Human Services Department of Behavioral Health grants back in March of 21. And then finally, the Minnesota State Arts Board Grant Administration back in 19. We have a pattern of systemic fraud in the state of Minnesota, and people have got to be aware of that. You reporting on this and making Minnesotans aware of it will help to increase that accountability. Over on my right, it's our magic money tree of fraud, and you will see systemic fraud in the roots of that tree. Feeding Our Future, $250 million. Medicaid, $50 million. Child care CCAP, $100 million. Frontline workers, you see the $45 million. That is known fraud, but up to $200 million was what was put out to those that were not eligible at the time. And then mismanagement and incompetence by both DHS and MDE. We know that we have a problem here in the state of Minnesota, and we need to take the OLA reports serious. That is a nonpartisan organization that has brought to light the fraud, and that's what we want to do. We want to hold those accountable, make changes going forward, and stop the complete funding of fraud here in the state of Minnesota. When we're talking about these numbers, these large dollar amounts, I think people tend to almost glaze over. You hear $250 million. You hear less than that. We are talking about over $500 million of money that should have gone to the most vulnerable that didn't go out, but it went out to fraud. Please help us get this message out to Minnesotans. This is fraud, and it needs to stop. And with that, I would be happy to take questions.
Do you have any thoughts on like the level of pushback that Indy and Dolly gave to the OLA after their reports came out?
You know, there were in the report, and that's available publicly, their statements. And then also I would say, if you watch the OLA hearing specifically on Feeding Our Future, you know, the commissioner said that he was not there to assess blame. When we have fraud, someone has to be accountable to that. So regardless of commissioners are giving, if they're giving pushback or not on the OLA, that's why this falls squarely on the shoulders of our governor. He has got to take responsibility. If those in his administration and the commissioners that he has hand selected are not willing to take responsibility, then he needs to. Other questions?
Alluded to maybe solutions. Is there more that can be done? OLA done a whole lot of work with a relative handful of people. Does it need to be bigger? Does it need to have broader duties? Is there some other entity that could come in and be a, you know, not just a report writer, but a prosecutor?
Yeah, in every one of the OLA reports, it's important to know that they give recommendations. And one of the recommendations given by the OLA on the Minnesota Frontline Worker Pay Program, again, $200 million, one of their top recommendations was that the legislature should consider the amount of risk the state is willing to accept when establishing programs quickly and with eligibility conditions that rely on self-attestation. I think the legislature needs to hold the agencies accountable. That is our job. We can't continually be giving out money and appropriating money if there's no accountability and reports back. So that would be the beginning. We also know in some of the older reports that have come out that some of the recommendations from the OLA were not followed. That is the legislator's job then to hold those agencies and those commissioners accountable. These were the recommendations. Have you followed through? And if you haven't followed through, why not, or what has changed? That's a starting point for possible solutions. That is going to take balanced government. That is going to take a divided legislature to make sure that all voices are being heard and compromise can be found and the seriousness of fraud can be taken as serious as it needs to be and then brought back into solutions that will stop the fraud.
So it's-
And I'm going to actually have Representative Novotny address this for just a moment.
I'm Representative Paul Novotny, 30B, and I'm the Minority Public Safety lead. And specifically to your question, what's being done, I met with fraud investigators back when Feeding Our Future first broke, and several of them from different agencies tell me that they are obstructed from within their agencies. They're supposed to be doing these investigations and have access to paperwork, but they get told that they're not granted access to these files that they're supposed to be investigating without a court order. And there are times that they've had to get a subpoena or an actual warrant to get information from their own agencies. That is, to me, an indication of willful obstruction, and that's the thing where, as Leader Dama said, legislative oversight will bring that to light and that we can start making those changes.
Whistleblowers too.
Do you think these inspector generals that are starting to show up, I mean, DHS had one during the childcare problems. Education has just added an inspector general. Do you think there's any there?
You know, I believe that with the Office of Inspector Generals that have been added to MDE, I would say wait and see. You know, we know DHS had one during the child care fraud, as you had mentioned, and yet there was still fraud. And so I would say wait and see, but again, the legislature has to hold the agencies accountable. We are the ones that are appropriating funds, and why would we continually appropriate funds going forward if there's no accountability for the problems that have been noted in the past?
What does it look like for the legislature to hold agencies accountable? Is that policy changes?
You know, as far as where we are setting budgets and we're going forward on it, if there is fraud, we know that we need to be assured that those agencies have put into place some of the recommendations from the OLA that is going to change it going forward. I think that's an important point to start with. Holding the commissioners, bringing them in for hearings, holding them accountable for what is happening in their agencies. As Representative Novotny had alluded to, there's a resistance within the agencies and how they actually get the people doing the work, how they're getting the information that they need, and that needs to stop.
You guys have known about a lot of this stuff for quite a while. Why are you coming out now after the session's over? Couldn't you have done this during the session? Or even last year?
You know, what we've done, and if you remember back to 2018, 2019, as the reports came out on the child care assistance program, when that fraud was noted, House Republicans were making a lot with that. We were making sure that that fraud was noticed, but yet it was pushed aside. And so when you ask why didn't we come forward, the two top OLA reports came out after the session was over, Feeding Our Future and the Frontline Worker Pay. What we are doing today is we are just saying it's not just those, and it's easy to kind of hide those stories in the middle of the summer. OLA reports come out, didn't look real good, nobody's been held accountable, but we're going to kind of push that to the side. That was a bad week for the Waltz administration. Those came out back to back. On top of that, something that is not even here right now, there's an FBI investigation on autism. So in the last 5 years, with the issue of autism, both diagnosis and the pay for services on that, in 5 years, there has been a 700% increase on the number of people that are doing the diagnosis of autism. And we know that the families that are dealing with kids, both young and as they move into adulthood, need resources. But 700% increase on those doing the services, but a 3,000% increase on the payments going out to those agencies. There's an FBI investigation on that. We have eyes wide open. You are not hearing this from the majority party, one party, Democrat control in the state of Minnesota. They are not walking you through this. House Republicans are, because we're saying we want this to stop.
Leader David, have you been told by law enforcement or the agency or the Waltz administration that there is an FBI investigation, or are you referencing the Reformers report?
That is referenced from the Reformers report that has come out on that.
Have you asked any questions to DHS about it specifically yourself?
Not specifically at this point, and nor has DHS come out and said that they are fully cooperating and looking at it.
You just kind of touched on it a little with the autism program, but are there other programs when you talk about, tightening up, putting more safeguards in place that you have on the top of your list for bringing up next?
You know, we're going to go ahead and start right here with what we know and where there is fraud. We have 13 items here. I read them off, but we have 13 items here. That's going to be our starting point. Unfortunately, when we know there's fraud in the state of Minnesota and agencies are working in silos and not doing cross-referencing to the level that it needs to be done, this is the tip of the iceberg. So as more is revealed, we are hoping that we stop any additional fraud going forward. But right now, this is our starting point, and this is a heavy lift.
As members are door knocking right now, as you lead up to the fall election, how much of the conversation is about the illustration here in front of us versus top of the ticket presidential race as you're thinking about November?
You know, as I've been in conversation with people across the state, they are unaware that there was this much fraud. Just last week at an event, I was talking about it, and they said, how do we know this? How can we find this out? And I said, well, actually, we're having a press conference, and our media in Minnesota is going to do a great job of getting that word out. That is what Minnesotans are concerned about, is the Waltz-Biden economy right now and trying to afford their lives. So when we know dollars, good hard-earned dollars, are going out to fraudsters, when people become aware of that, they are very, very frustrated with it. But right now, people are just affording their lives. They're doing their summer, whatever that might look like in the state of Minnesota. Those are the conversations that are rising to the top.
Auditor Randall tried to put it together. And at one point, she volunteered that she was trying to figure out what's the through line through all this. And her one theory was that the people who run these programs see themselves as helpers. They see themselves as partners. They don't see themselves as enforcers, per se. Do you agree or disagree with that? Do you have any other theories as to what the through line is, other than the fact that there's not a Republican House? I mean, that's interesting because the Senate, when they had control, they did have hearings on feeding our future and other things. So you do have the power to convene those kind of things. But do you see any other through lines here that is explaining why this happened?
You know, I would say that the biggest through line is first a governor that will not hold his commissioners and agencies accountable. He has been governor since the beginning of our timeline here. That is the one common denominator as we look through that. But I would say the through lines and the things that are most egregious are the repeated finding of inadequate oversight and insufficient internal controls and a lack of transparency. And right now, with everyone keeping their jobs in all of the agencies, no one being held accountable, why would people want to do better when there's no consequence? Government agency is probably one of the few places that you can still slide by if you're not doing the right thing or even found to be doing the wrong thing. Those are the things that need to change.
And when you say held accountable, again, are you asking for people involved in these programs to be disciplined, fired, higher level commissioner or deputy commissioner?
Whatever it takes to make a change. Whatever it will take to make that change that is needed. Is the change that needs to happen. Any other questions?
As regards to the fact that we're currently in the middle of a divided government, has there been any receptivity by DFL representatives or senators towards taking any kind of measure toward accountability?
In Minnesota, we are in full Democrat control. In the state of Minnesota, have been for 2 years. We are not in divided government.
Do you think you guys have any say of what even happened these last 2 years? Do you have any say what happens these last 2 years or even 4 years?
What has happened over the last 2 years?
What happened is over the last 2 years, have you felt that the GOP has had anything to say? Or are you just basically sitting on the sidelines and watching?
You know, the Republicans have been doing a great job of bringing concerns forward, bringing solutions. When I think of different mandates that have been put on our businesses and on our school districts, we have brought forward amendments and solutions for a number of different areas. Unfortunately, the majority has pushed through because they have the votes and they haven't needed to work together in a more collaborative way. Divided government, balanced government in the state of Minnesota is what is needed at this point.
Can I ask an off topic, election related?
Sure.
What does, right now, one of the top race raters has just moved Minnesota slightly more competitive, given President Biden's debate performance. I'm wondering where your thinking is at right now and what this means if Minnesota does look more competitive for your bid to take back control of the House. Do you think about trying to expand your target list of seats you're going to try to flip? Does it make defending some difficult seats for you easier? Can you just...
You know, House Republicans, when we came in January of 23 under full Democrat control, it was going to be an opportunity to see how collaborative we could be and see what would be done for Minnesota. I think it's really important to realize that we had an $18 billion surplus that was spent and not returned to taxpayers. Our taxes and fees, as you saw, the delivery fee and other things that have just started July 1st, taxes and fees have gone up by another 38%, almost $10 billion. Minnesota is on an unsustainable route as far as financially. We are looking at a deficit down the road if we keep spending this way. So when we talk about what we are doing as far as on the campaign side, I'm happy to tell you that our plan that we have been working since January of 23 or even slightly before that remains the same. We will hold all 64 of our seats. We need to gain just 4. Our candidates are well known in their districts. They are working very hard. They are bringing to light concerns that Minnesotans have, and we are working very, very hard and are very hopeful of gaining the majority in the Minnesota House.
But surely the top of the ticket and turnout will have an impact.
Absolutely. And we are working toward that. We know that early voting has already started in the primaries. That started the end of June. Primary is August 13th. Minnesotans are just kind of wrapping their minds around, oh, maybe there's a primary. I've got to get out there. So we're pushing people to vote. And then with early voting starting September 20th, as everybody's back into a fall routine, we are definitely looking at banking our votes and getting people out early. So any other questions? Thank you so much. I really appreciate